The air in the Bridgeport Superior courtroom was so thick with tension, you could taste the metallic tang of fear. Flora stood alone at the defendant's table, her hands trembling as she shuffled a stack of disorganized papers. Across the aisle, her husband, Daniel Sterling, the untouchable real estate tycoon of Connecticut, leaned back in his leather chair. He didn't look worried. He looked bored. As his $800 an hour lawyer shredded Flora's character, Daniel caught her eye and offered a slow, chilling smirk. He thought he had already won. He thought she was weak. But he didn't know that inside that messy stack of papers was a single document that would not only end their marriage, but shatter his entire empire. Minutes later, that smirk would vanish, and the room would go deathly silent. Flora Vance had once believed in fairy tales. When she met Daniel Sterling 7 years ago at a charity gala in Hartford, he seemed like the embodiment of every romantic trope she had ever read about. He was 40, charming, incredibly wealthy, and focused entirely on her. Flora was 27, then a junior graphic designer struggling to pay off her student loans and sharing a cramped apartment in New Haven. Daniel swept her off her feet with a whirlwind courtship involving private jets to Paris and weekends in the Hamptons. 6 months later, they were married. But the fairy tale didn't have a happy ending. It had a lock. The transition from independent woman to trophy wife was subtle. First, Daniel suggested she quit her job. He argued that his schedule was too demanding and he needed her by his side for business dinners. Then came the isolation. He didn't like her friends. He claimed they were jealous of her new life. Slowly, Flora's world shrank until it consisted only of the sprawling Sterling estate in Greenwich, the staff who reported her every move to Daniel and Daniel himself. By year 5, the abuse had shifted from psychological to financial. Daniel controlled every penny. Flora had to ask permission to buy groceries. She had no access to their bank accounts, no credit cards in her own name, and no way out. When she discovered the text messages on his phone messages to a woman named Chloe, a 22-year-old intern at his firm, Sterling Dynamics, she finally snapped. She confronted him in their marble-floored kitchen. Daniel didn't deny it. He laughed. "Go ahead, Flora," he had sneered, pouring himself a glass of scotch. "Leave. But remember, you signed a prenup. If you walk out with nothing. No money, no house. And I will make sure you never work in this state again." He was right about the prenup, or so he thought. Flora spent the next 2 years planning her escape. She played the role of the dutiful, submissive wife perfectly. She hosted his dinner parties, smiled for the society pages, and ignored the lipstick stains on his collars. But in the shadows, she was watching. She was listening, and most importantly, she was documenting. The breaking point came when Daniel announced he was liquidating a significant portion of their assets to invest in a new offshore venture in the Cayman Islands. Flora knew what that meant. He was hiding money. He was preparing to discard her. She filed for divorce the next day. The retaliation was swift and brutal. Daniel froze the allowance account he gave her. He fired the household staff she was close to. He hired Silas Thorne, a divorce attorney known in legal circles as the Butcher of Bridgeport, a man who didn't just win cases, he destroyed lives. Flora couldn't afford a lawyer. She had visited 5 different firms, but the moment they heard she was going up against Daniel Sterling, they politely declined. The conflict of interest runs deep when your husband owns half the office buildings in the city. She had no choice. She would have to represent herself. On the morning of the trial, Flora stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her small rented motel room, the only place she could afford after Daniel kicked her out of the estate. She wore a simple navy blazer she had bought at a thrift store. She looked tired. Her eyes were rimmed with dark circles, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection. "You know the truth. He doesn't." She picked up her briefcase, a battered leather bag that contained her life's work for the past 2 years. It wasn't much, just a series of binders and a USB drive. But it was all she had. As she walked up the steps of the courthouse, the paparazzi were already there. Daniel had tipped them off, of course. He wanted her humiliation to be public. Flashes popped, blinding her. "Flora, is it true you're asking for $10 million? Flora, did you cheat on Daniel?" She kept her head down and pushed through the doors. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of floor wax and old wood. She found courtroom 4B and pushed the heavy oak doors open. Daniel was already there. He was surrounded by a team of 3 lawyers, all in bespoke suits. They were laughing about something, looking relaxed and confident. Daniel turned as she entered. His eyes raked over her cheap blazer, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It was the look of a predator watching a wounded gazelle limp into the clearing. Judge Margaret Halloway entered the courtroom with a swirl of black robes. She was a stern woman in her 60s, known for her no-nonsense attitude and her impatience with theatrics. She took her seat at the bench and peered over her spectacles at the assembly. "Case number 4492, Sterling v. Sterling," the bailiff announced. "Appearances," Judge Halloway said, her voice dry. Silas Thorne stood up. He was a tall man with silver hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Silas Thorne, representing the plaintiff, Mr. Daniel Sterling, Your Honor." Flora stood up, her legs feeling like lead. "Flora Vance, representing myself, Your Honor." The judge paused, looking at Flora with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Ms. Vance, are you sure you wish to proceed? Pro se. This is a high-asset divorce case involving complex financial structures. Mr. Thorne is a very experienced litigator." "I have no choice, Your Honor," Flora said, her voice trembling slightly before she steadied it. "I cannot afford counsel, and my husband has ensured that no local firm will take my case on contingency." Silas Thorne chuckled softly, just loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "Objection, Your Honor. That is a baseless accusation." "Sustained," Judge Halloway sighed. "Stick to the facts, Ms. Vance. We will proceed. Mr. Thorne, your opening statement." Thorne moved to the center of the room, buttoning his jacket. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the gallery, playing to the audience. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice smooth as silk. "This case is simple. It is a tragedy, really. A classic case of a woman who married a successful, hard-working man, enjoyed the fruits of his labor for 7 years, and now, upon realizing that the marriage has run its natural course, seeks to extort him." He gestured toward Daniel, who looked suitably solemn and aggrieved. "Mr. Sterling is a pillar of this community," Thorne continued. "He employs thousands of people. He donates millions to charity. He provided Miss Vance with a life of luxury most people only dream of. And how did she repay him? With paranoia, with jealousy, and now with greed." Thorne walked over to the defense table and loomed over Flora. "We will present evidence that Miss Vance has been emotionally unstable," Thorne said, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "That she has harassed Mr. Sterling's employees. That she refused to seek employment despite having a degree. The prenuptial agreement she signed is ironclad. It clearly states that in the event of a divorce, she is entitled to a lump sum of 50,000 and nothing more. Yet she is here wasting the court's time demanding half of an empire she did not build. He turned back to the judge. We ask that the court enforce the prenup, dismiss these frivolous claims, and grant Mr. Sterling the peace he deserves. He sat down. Daniel patted him on the back. Ms. Vance, Judge Halloway said, your opening statement. Flora stood up. She didn't have the polish of Silas Thorne. She didn't have the theatrical gestures. She held a single piece of paper in her hand. Your Honor, Flora said, Mr. Thorne is right about one thing. This is a tragedy. She looked directly at Daniel. For a second his mask slipped, and she saw a flicker of annoyance. But it is not a tragedy of greed, Flora continued. It is a tragedy of fraud, Mr. Thorne mentioned the prenuptial agreement. He called it ironclad. But a contract is only valid if both parties entered into it with full disclosure. I intend to prove that Daniel Sterling has never disclosed anything fully in his life. I intend to prove, Flora's voice gained strength, that the assets Mr. Sterling claims to own are a fraction of his true wealth. I intend to prove that he has systematically hidden funds, falsified tax returns, and coerced me into signing documents under duress. Silas Thorne jumped up. Objection. These are wild, unsubstantiated allegations. This is an opening statement, Mr. Thorne, the judge snapped. Sit down. Continue, Ms. Vance. I'm not here for his money because I am greedy. Flora finished, her eyes locking onto Daniel's smirk. I am here because for 7 years I was a prisoner in a golden cage, and today I am not just asking for a divorce. I am asking for justice. She sat down. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Daniel leaned over to Thorne and whispered something. Thorne laughed. Daniel looked at Flora, and there it was again, that smirk. He mouthed 2 words to her. You're dead. The trial began. The first witness was Daniel's chief accountant, a man named Arthur Prane. Prane was a nervous, balding man who had worked for Sterling Dynamics for 20 years. Thorne guided him through the financials with ease. Mr. Prane, what is the current valuation of Mr. Sterling's liquid assets? Approximately $4 million, mostly in stocks and bonds, Prane answered, wiping sweat from his forehead. And the real estate holdings, heavily leveraged. The debts almost equal the value of the properties due to recent market downturns. So, Thorne said, looking at the judge, Mr. Sterling is actually in a precarious financial position. Yes, sir. Very precarious. It was a lie. A masterfully constructed lie backed up by stacks of official-looking documents. To the untrained eye, Daniel Sterling was barely staying afloat. Your witness, Thorne said, gesturing dismissively to Flora. Flora stood up. She picked up a blue binder from her table. She walked toward the witness stand. Arthur Prane wouldn't meet her eyes. Mr. Prane, Flora said, you stated that the real estate holdings are heavily leveraged. That's correct. Specifically the commercial properties in downtown Bridgeport. Yes. Flora flipped open her binder. I have here a document from the land registry. It shows a transfer of title for the building at 405 Elm Street, the Sterling Tower. Can you tell me who currently holds the title? Prane squinted. Sterling Dynamics, LLC. And who is the primary shareholder of Sterling Dynamics? Mr. Sterling. Is it true, Prane? Flora asked, pulling out a second sheet of paper. That Sterling Dynamics pays a monthly consulting fee of $150,000 to a company called Apex Solutions. Prane stiffened. I believe so. Standard business practice. And where is Apex Solutions based? I don't recall. Let me refresh your memory, Flora said, her voice cutting through the room. Apex Solutions is registered in Panama, and the sole signatory for that company is not Mr. Sterling. It is you, Mr. Prane. Silence rippled through the courtroom. Thorne stopped writing on his notepad. Objection, Thorne barked. Relevance. It goes to the credibility of the witness, Your Honor, Flora said quickly. If the witness is receiving millions of dollars into an offshore account from my husband's company that suggests a conflict of interest, or perhaps a bribe. Judge Halloway peered at Prane over her glasses. Mr. Prane, answer the question. Are you the signatory for Apex Solutions? Prane looked at Daniel. Daniel's face had gone hard, his eyes narrowing. Only for administrative purposes, Prane stammered. So you admit it? Flora said. Mr. Prane, isn't it true that Apex Solutions doesn't actually do any consulting, that it is simply a shell company used to siphon profits out of Sterling Dynamics so they don't appear on the marital balance sheet? Objection, Thorne roared. She is badgering the witness. Sustained, the judge said, but she was looking at Prane with deep suspicion. Move on, Ms. Vance. Flora didn't need to move on. The damage was done. She had drawn first blood. She returned to her seat. Daniel wasn't smirking anymore. He was staring at her with cold, calculated rage. He leaned toward Thorne and whispered urgently. Thorne nodded, his face grim. They realized she wasn't just defending herself. She was hunting. But they had no idea she was just getting started. The lunch recess was a blur. Flora sat on a bench in the hallway, eating a stale granola bar she had found in the bottom of her purse. Her hands were still shaking, but the adrenaline of catching Arthur Prane in a lie was coursing through her veins. She knew, however, that Silas Thorne was not a man who took embarrassment lightly. The counterattack would be vicious. When court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted. The air conditioning hummed a little louder, and the gallery was fuller. Word had spread that the trophy wife was actually fighting back. Call your next witness, Judge Halloway ordered. Thorne stood up, looking remarkably composed. He adjusted his silk tie. The defense calls Dr. Julian Vance. Flora's head snapped up. Julian wasn't a relative. Vance was her maiden name, and Julian was a common surname, but Dr. Julian Vance was a high-profile psychiatrist in Greenwich. Flora had never met him. A man with a goatee and thick-rimmed glasses took the stand. He looked every bit the serious academic. Dr. Vance, Thorne began. Have you had occasion to review the medical history and behavioral patterns of the defendant? Flora Vance. I have, the doctor said, his voice baritone and soothing. Mr. Sterling retained me to evaluate the psychological stability of his household. And what was your conclusion regarding Mrs. Vance? I diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder, with paranoid delusions, Dr. Vance stated calmly. Subject exhibits signs of pathological jealousy, irrational outbursts, and a detachment from reality. The gallery murmured. Flora felt the heat rise in her cheeks. It was a complete fabrication. She frequently accused Mr. Sterling of infidelity without proof, the doctor continued. She imagined conspiracies against her. It is my professional opinion that her claims of financial fraud are merely an extension of these delusions. Thorne looked at the jury box, though there was no jury, only the judge, and then at Flora. No further questions. Flora stood up. She felt small. This man was an expert, Who was she? A graphic designer with a thrift store blazer. But she remembered something Daniel had once said about experts. Everyone has a price tag. Flora, you just have to find where the barcode is. She walked to the podium. Dr. Vance, Flora said, you diagnosed me with narcissistic personality disorder. Yes. And you based this diagnosis on how many sessions? How many times did we meet face to face? Dr. Vance shifted in his seat. Well, in cases of high conflict, a direct interview is not always possible. I based my assessment on the detailed journals provided by Mr. Sterling, interviews with staff, and recorded voicemails. So 0, Flora said sharply. You have never spoken to me. You have never looked me in the eye until this moment. Is that correct? It is common practice in forensic. Is it correct? Flora pressed. Yes, we never met. Flora picked up a document from her table. I have here the invoice you submitted to Sterling Dynamics. It is dated 3 months ago. The amount is $25,000. The description of services reads, consultation regarding EV strategy. Strategy doctor. Since when is a medical diagnosis called a strategy? Thorne jumped up. Objection. She is twisting the witness's words. The document speaks for itself, Judge Halloway said, peering at the invoice Flora held up. Dr. Vance, did you coordinate your diagnosis with Mr. Sterling's legal team prior to filing your report? We discussed the implications, Dr. Vance stuttered. No further questions, Flora said, tossing the invoice onto the defense table. Thorne's jaw tightened. He signaled to the bailiff. Defense calls Chloe de Winter. The doors opened, and a hush fell over the room. Chloe de Winter walked in. She was 22, stunningly beautiful with blonde hair, cascading over a modest black dress that was clearly bought specifically for court to make her look innocent. She was the intern, the mistress. She took the stand, refusing to look at Flora. Miss de Winter, Thorne said gently, you worked at Sterling Dynamics? Yes, Chloe whispered, wiping a non-existent tear from her eye. Did you ever have interactions with the defendant, Mrs. Vance? Yes. She came to the office. Chloe's voice trembled. She screamed at me. She called me terrible names. She threatened to throw acid in my face if I didn't stay away from her husband. And were you having an affair with Mr. Sterling? No, Chloe gasped, looking at Daniel with wide, adoring eyes. Mr. Sterling was a mentor to me. He was kind. Mrs. Vance was just crazy with jealousy. She terrified me. Thank you, Chloe, Thorne said softly. Your witness. Flora stared at the girl. She remembered the texts. She remembered the photos she had found on Daniel's cloud account. Photos of them on a yacht in heavy embrace. Flora approached the stand. She didn't look angry. She looked sad. Chloe, Flora said, you're under oath. You know what perjury is, right? I'm telling the truth. Chloe snapped, her innocent mask slipping for a second. You said you never had a relationship with my husband, that he was just a mentor. That's right. Flora walked back to her table and picked up the USB drive. She plugged it into the court's presentation laptop. Your Honor, I would like to submit Defense Exhibit C, a series of audio recordings recovered from the cloud server of the family home's smart speaker system, specifically the master bedroom. Daniel sat up straight. His face went pale. He hadn't realized the smart speakers recorded when they were activated by voice commands. Objection, Thorne shouted. Privacy violation. Mr. Sterling installed the system himself to monitor the staff, Flora countered. He waived his expectation of privacy in his own home when he recorded me for years. These are his recordings." Judge Halloway nodded. "Play it." The audio crackled through the courtroom speakers. Voice 1. "Daniel. Don't worry about her. She's useless. As soon as the IPO launches, I'm kicking her to the curb. You'll be the new Mrs. Sterling, baby." Voice 2. Chloe. "But she suspects something, Daniel. She looked at me weird at the Christmas party." Voice 1. Daniel. "Let her look. She's too stupid to do anything. Besides, the prenup leaves her with nothing. You and I are going to take the jet to Milan the day the divorce is final." The recording ended. The silence in the room was deafening. Flora looked at Chloe. The young woman's face was bright red. "Chloe," Flora asked softly, "did you go to Milan?" Chloe looked at Daniel. Daniel was staring at the table, refusing to meet her gaze. "No," Chloe whispered. He took his lawyer." "He lied to you too, Chloe," Flora said, her voice filled with unexpected compassion. "He told you he loved you. He told you I was the villain. But in that recording, did you hear him talk about love, or did you hear him talk about a replacement?" Chloe started to cry. Real tears this time. "I have no further questions," Flora said. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the courtroom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the silent air. Silas Thorne looked like a man who had just swallowed a lemon. His star witnesses had backfired. His narrative was crumbling. But Thorne was a veteran. He knew that emotion didn't win divorce cases. Law won divorce cases. Contracts won divorce cases. "Your Honor," Thorne said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "While these theatrics are entertaining, they are ultimately irrelevant to the division of assets. We move for a summary judgment based on the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties on August 14th, 7 years ago." He pulled a thick leather-bound document from his briefcase. "This document," Thorne said, holding it aloft like a holy relic, "stipulates that all assets acquired before and during the marriage remain the sole property of the individual whose name is on the title. It stipulates a fixed exit settlement of $50,000. Ms. Vance signed this voluntarily. She had legal counsel at the time, a court-appointed advisor. There is no legal basis to pierce the corporate veil or divide the estate." Judge Halloway took the document. She put on her glasses and read through the clauses. The courtroom waited. Flora stood still, her hands clasped in front of her. "The document appears to be in order," the judge said slowly. "Ms. Vance, did you sign this?" "I did, Your Honor," Flora said. "And were you coerced? Did he hold a gun to your head?" "No, Your Honor, not a gun." "Then I'm afraid," the judge said, looking down at Flora with a grim expression, "that the contract stands. Infidelity, while morally reprehensible, does not nullify a valid prenuptial agreement in the state of Connecticut. Unless you can prove the contract itself is fraudulent, Mr. Sterling's assets are protected." This was the moment. Daniel Sterling, who had been hunched over, slowly straightened his spine. He looked at the judge. Then he turned his head to look at Flora. He smirked. It was a slow, deliberate curling of the lip. It was a look that said, "I told you so." It was a look that said, "You are nothing. I am everything." He even gave a little shrug, as if to say, "Nice try, sweetie." The gallery saw it. The judge saw it. It was the arrogance of a man who believes he is untouchable. Flora saw it too, and for the first time that day, she smiled back. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a demolition expert pressing the detonator. "Your Honor," Flora said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Mr. Thorne is correct. The prenup is valid. I am not contesting the validity of the prenuptial agreement." Daniel's smirk widened. Thorne looked confused. If she wasn't contesting it, why was she still standing there? However, Flora continued reaching into her messy stack of papers. She bypassed the binders. She bypassed the USB drive. She reached for a single thin manila envelope at the very bottom. "The prenuptial agreement applies to assets owned by Daniel Sterling." "Yes, obviously," Thorne scoffed. "But it does not apply," Flora said, opening the envelope, "to assets owned by me." "You don't own anything," Daniel blurted out, breaking his silence. "I paid for the clothes on your back." "Mr. Sterling, be quiet," the judge snapped. "Ms. Vance, explain yourself." Flora pulled out a document with a heavy blue seal. "Earlier, Mr. Prane testified that Sterling Dynamics pays millions in consulting fees to a shell company in Panama called Apex Solutions. He claimed he was the signatory." Flora walked to the bench and handed the document to the judge. "This is the certificate of incorporation for Apex Solutions, retrieved directly from the Panamanian Public Registry through a subpoena I issued 3 weeks ago. It turns out Mr. Sterling is very careful about not putting his name on illegal offshore accounts. He wanted to hide the money from the IRS, and he wanted to hide it from the courts. So he needed a proxy, someone he trusted, someone he thought he owned." The judge's eyes widened as she read the paper. "Mr. Sterling used a power of attorney I signed during our first year of marriage, supposedly for tax purposes, to set up Apex Solutions," Flora explained, turning to face the stunned courtroom. "But he made a mistake, a fatal mistake. He didn't make himself the beneficial owner. He made me the beneficial owner." Daniel's smirk vanished. His face went grey. "He put everything in my name," Flora said, her voice rising. "The offshore accounts, the hidden real estate titles, the crypto wallets. He put them in my name to distance himself from the tax fraud, thinking he could control me forever, thinking I would never look." Flora turned to Daniel. He was gripping the table so hard his knuckles were white. "According to the Panamanian government," Flora said, "I am the sole proprietor of Apex Solutions, and Apex Solutions currently holds Your Honor." "What is the balance listed on the attached bank statement?" Judge Halloway adjusted her glasses, her eyebrows disappearing into her hairline. $142 million, the judge read. The entire court fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. "The prenuptial agreement says what's mine is mine," Flora said, her voice deadly calm. "That money is in my name. It is in my account. It is, legally speaking, my money." She looked at Daniel. He was gasping for air, looking at Thorne, who was frantically shuffling papers, realizing there was nothing he could do. If they claimed the money was Daniel's, they were admitting to federal tax evasion and money laundering, which would send Daniel to prison for 20 years. If they stayed silent, the money belonged to Flora. "So," Flora said, closing her briefcase with a satisfying snap, "I am willing to settle Mr. Sterling, but the price has gone up." Daniel looked like he was having a heart attack. The smirk was gone, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of a man watching his life disintegrate. "Mr. Thorne," Judge Halloway said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Do you have a response?" Thorne stood up. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his client, then back at the judge. "We request a recess," Thorne croaked. "Granted." The judge banged her gavel. 10 minutes. As the room erupted into chaos, Flora didn't move. She just watched Daniel. He was staring at her as if she were a ghost. But the story wasn't over. Flora knew Daniel. A cornered animal is the most dangerous. He wouldn't just give up the money. He would try to destroy her before the final gavel fell. She checked her watch. She had one more card to play, and it involved the one person Daniel feared more than the IRS. The recess was supposed to be 10 minutes, but it felt like 10 years. Flora didn't stay in the courtroom. She walked to the small attorney-client conference room that the bailiff had unlocked for her. It was a windowless box with a scratched wooden table and buzzing fluorescent lights that made everyone look sickly. She sat down, her hands trembling not from fear anymore, but from the sheer magnitude of what she had just done. She had just stolen $142 million from the most dangerous man in Connecticut. The door flew open. It wasn't the bailiff. It was Daniel. He slammed the door shut behind him and locked it. His face was a mask of contorted rage, veins bulging in his neck like cords of rope. Silas Thorne was nowhere to be seen. Daniel had clearly slipped away from his handler. "You stupid, ignorant woman," Daniel hissed, stalking toward her. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Flora didn't flinch. She remained seated, her hands folded on the table. "I believe I just secured my alimony, Daniel." "Alimony?" Daniel laughed, a high, jagged sound that bordered on hysteria. He leaned over the table, his expensive cologne now smelling like fear and sour sweat. "You think this is about money? You think I'm worried about the IRS? You think I'm worried about jail?" He lowered his voice to a terrifying whisper. "That money isn't mine, Flora." Flora raised an eyebrow. "The bank records say it's mine. The incorporation papers say it's mine. So if it's not yours and it's not mine, whose is it?" Daniel wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "There are people, investors. People who don't file lawsuits, Flora. People who handle breaches of contract with a bullet to the back of the head. That $142 million includes their capital. If that account gets frozen, if they think you stole it, they won't just kill me. They will kill you. They will find your parents in Florida. They will burn everything down." For a second, a flicker of doubt crossed Flora's mind. She knew Daniel did business with shady figures' construction contracts that bypassed zoning laws, cash payments in briefcases, but this sounded like a bad movie. "You're lying," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "You're trying to scare me into signing the money back to you." "I am trying to save your life." Daniel slammed his fist on the table, making the light fixture rattle. "Here is the deal. You sign a transfer order right now. You give me back control of Apex Solutions. In exchange, I will give you $5 million cash today. And you leave the country. You disappear." Flora looked at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes. It was real. He was terrified. $5 million, she repeated slowly. 10. Daniel countered immediately. 10 million. Just sign the damn paper. It was a tempting offer. $10 million was enough to start over anywhere in the world. It was freedom. It was safety. But then she remembered Chloe de Winter's tears. She remembered the years of gaslighting. She remembered the way he had isolated her from her dying grandmother because traveling was too inconvenient for his schedule. She remembered the smirk. Flora stood up. She was shorter than him, but in that moment she felt 10 feet tall. No, she said. Daniel blinked. What? I said, no, I don't want your hush money, and I don't care about your investors. Because, Daniel, you forgot one thing about me. You forgot that I used to be a graphic designer. What does that have to do with anything? I notice details, Flora said, stepping closer to him. Like the fact that every time you had a late-night board meeting on a Tuesday, your GPS tracker showed you at the shipping docks in New Haven. Like the fact that Apex Solutions wasn't just receiving consulting fees, it was receiving wire transfers from shell companies in Estonia and Cyprus. Daniel took a step back. You hacked my GPS. I didn't have to hack it. You shared your location with me 3 years ago, so I could have dinner ready when you got home. You never turned it off. Flora checked her watch. The recess is over, Daniel, and I think there is someone in the courtroom who wants to meet your investors. Daniel grabbed her arm. His grip was bruising. You are not going back in there. Let go of me, Flora said calmly. You're going to sign. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. Then came a sharp, authoritative knock. Open the door, bailiff. Daniel froze. He released her arm. Flora smoothed her blazer. She looked at her husband, a man she had once loved, now reduced to a sweating, desperate criminal. See you in court, she said. She unlocked the door and walked out, leaving him standing in the flickering fluorescent light. The courtroom was buzzing with energy when Flora returned. The gallery was full. Even the court clerks were whispering behind their hands. Silas Thorne was wiping his forehead with a handkerchief, looking like a man who was actively calculating his malpractice insurance premiums. Daniel entered a moment later. He looked disheveled. He sat down heavily next to Thorne and whispered something into the lawyer's ear. Thorne went pale and shook his head vigorously. All rise, the bailiff called out. Judge Halloway returned to the bench. She looked refreshed while everyone else looked exhausted. We are back on the record, the judge said. Mr. Thorne, have you and your client reached a decision regarding the settlement? Thorne stood up. His voice was shaky. Your Honor, my client asserts that the funds in the Apex Solutions account are partially encumbered by third-party liabilities. We request a continuance to audit the— No, Flora interrupted from her table. Ms. Vance. The judge looked at her. No continuance, Your Honor, Flora said. Mr. Sterling is trying to buy time to move the money. He just offered me $10 million in the hallway to transfer the funds back to him immediately. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Thorne closed his eyes in defeat. Is this true, Mr. Sterling? The judge demanded. Did you attempt to intimidate the witness during a recess? Daniel stood up, knocking his chair over. She's stealing from me. It's my money, I earned it. So you admit the money is yours? Flora asked quickly. You admit you violated federal tax laws and the disclosure requirements of this court. I admit that you are a thief, Daniel shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. You think you're smart. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Actually, a deep voice boomed from the back of the courtroom. We have a pretty good idea. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. 3 men and 2 women in dark suits walked in. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace that instantly identified them as law enforcement. Leading them was a tall man with a shaved head and a badge hanging from his neck. Judge Halloway banged her gavel. What is the meaning of this interruption? The lead agent walked past the bar, ignoring Silas Thorne entirely. He stopped in the center of the room and looked at the judge. Special Agent Miller, FBI White-Collar Crimes Division, he announced. We apologize for the interruption, Your Honor, but we are executing a federal warrant. Daniel Sterling stopped breathing. He slumped back against the defense table, his legs giving out. Agent Miller turned to Flora and gave her a curt nod. It wasn't a nod of strangers. It was a nod of recognition. Silas Thorne sputtered. "Warrant on what grounds?" "This is a civil divorce proceeding." "It was a civil divorce proceeding," Agent Miller said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket. "It is now a crime scene. Daniel Sterling, you are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to traffic prohibited goods." "Trafficking?" Thorne looked at Daniel with horror. "Daniel, what is he talking about?" Agent Miller looked at the gallery. "Apex Solutions isn't just a tax shelter. It's the primary laundering vehicle for the Petrov Syndicate's shipping operations in New Haven. We've been tracking the money for 2 years. We couldn't prove the link to Sterling until today." He turned to Flora. "Until Mrs. Sterling brought us the key." The courtroom erupted. Reporters were shouting questions. The judge was banging her gavel, but no one was listening. Flora stood perfectly still in the hurricane of noise. The truth was, Flora hadn't just been defending herself. 6 months ago, she had found a discrepancy in the household accounts that didn't make sense. She had hired a private investigator using the grocery money she skimmed, who told her it was too big for him. He had referred her to the FBI. Flora had been working as a confidential informant for Agent Miller for 4 months. The messy papers she had brought to court. The chaotic defense, it was all part of the plan. The FBI needed Daniel to admit ownership of the funds on the record, or for the money to be legally attributed to him in a court judgment to trigger the seizure. But Flora's beneficial owner twist. That was her own addition. The FBI didn't know about that. She had improvised that to force Daniel into a corner where he would crack, and he had cracked. 2 agents moved toward Daniel. He backed away, his hands up. No, you don't understand," Daniel stammered. "I was forced. They made me do it." "You can tell that to the U.S. attorney," Agent Miller said. "Cuff him." As the metal cuffs clicked around Daniel's wrists, the wrists that used to wear a $50,000 Rolex, he looked across the room at Flora. There was no smirk this time. There was no arrogance. There was only the hollow, devastating realization that the woman he had treated like a piece of furniture, a background character in the movie of his life, had just written the ending. "Flora," he pleaded, his voice cracking as they dragged him toward the side exit. "Flora, help me. Tell them I'm a good man." Flora watched him go. She didn't look away. She didn't cry. She picked up her microphone, which was still live. "He smirked," she said, softly, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. "He smirked because he thought I was weak. But he forgot that even a cage made of gold is still a miecz. And eventually the bird learns how to pick the lock." Judge Halloway stared at Flora. She slowly put down her gavel. "Case dismissed," the judge whispered. "The assets in question are hereby frozen pending federal investigation." She looked at Flora with a newfound respect. "Miss Vance," the judge said, "you are free to go." But it wasn't over yet. The money was gone. The husband was gone. But the danger Daniel had warned her about, the investors. As Flora walked out of the courthouse flanked by Agent Miller and his team, she saw a black SUV parked across the street with tinted windows. It idled for a moment, the engine purring like a large cat, and then slowly peeled away into the traffic. Flora took a deep breath of the fresh air. It smelled like exhaust and rain, but to her it smelled like victory. 6 months had passed since the gavel fell in Bridgeport, echoing with the finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. Flora Vance sat on the wraparound porch of a weathered cedar shingle cottage overlooking the grey, churning waters of the Atlantic Ocean. She was hundreds of miles away from the manicured lawns of Greenwich, hidden away in a quiet corner of Bar Harbor, Maine. Here the air didn't smell of expensive perfume anxiety and deceit. It smelled of salt spray pine needles, and for the first time in 7 years, absolute freedom. She pulled her wool cardigan tighter around herself against the biting coastal wind. On the rustic wooden table beside her, steaming mug of Earl Grey tea, lay a copy of the Wall Street Journal. She had read the article 3 times already, but the words still felt surreal, like a headline from a different dimension. Real estate magnate Daniel Sterling, sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. The article was thorough. It detailed the collapse of the Sterling Empire with brutal efficiency. It described how the Sterling Tower, once the jewel of the Bridgeport skyline, had been seized by the Department of Justice and was currently being auctioned off to pay creditors. It mentioned the liquidation of Sterling Dynamics. It even had a small sidebar about the Petrov Syndicate, the Russian shipping ring that had been using Daniel's shell companies to wash dirty money. They had been rolled up in a series of coordinated FBI raids just 48 hours after Flora walked out of that courtroom. But the part that made Flora's heart beat a little faster was the paragraph about Daniel himself. The article described a man broken. During the sentencing hearing, Daniel Sterling, the man who once terrorized waiters for bringing him sparkling water, instead of still had wept openly. He had begged the judge for leniency, citing stress and bad influences. Judge Holloway hadn't blinked. She gave him the maximum sentence for racketeering, wire fraud, and tax evasion. He was currently being processed at FCI Fort Dix, a low to medium security federal correctional institution in New Jersey. He would be trading his Italian silk suits for khaki jumpers and his nights in the Hamptons for a 6x8 concrete cell shared with a stranger. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke Flora's reverie. Her stomach tightened instinctively, a phantom reflex from living in a war zone for so long. She looked down the long, winding driveway. A black Chevrolet Tahoe was pulling up. It wasn't the menacing SUV of the syndicate. It was government issue. Flora didn't run. She didn't hide. She simply picked up her tea and waited. The door opened, and Special Agent Miller stepped out. He looked different out of the courtroom context. He was wearing a casual windbreaker and jeans, and the perpetual frown he wore during the investigation had softened into something resembling fatigue, or perhaps relief. He walked up the porch steps, the wood creaking under his boots. "Miss Vance," Miller said, nodding respectfully. "Or do you prefer Miss Sterling?" "Flora," she corrected him, her voice steady. "My divorce was finalized in absentia last week. I burned the name Sterling in the fireplace yesterday." Miller cracked a small smile. "Good. It didn't suit you." He pulled out a chair and sat down opposite her, looking out at the ocean. "Nice place. Hard to find. It took my team 3 days to locate you, and we have satellites." "That was the point," Flora said. "Are the investors still a problem, Agent Miller?" "The Petrovs." Miller shook his head. "Gone. The intel you provided from the Apex Solutions server gave us everything. Names, dates, account numbers. We indicted 34 people last month. The organization has been dismantled. You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore, Flora. The monsters are in Kupsos." Flora let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for half a year. "So why are you here? If the case is closed, surely the FBI has other fires to put out." Miller reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with red tape. He placed it on the table between them. "The case is closed," Miller agreed, "but the books aren't." Flora looked at the envelope. "What is this, Tuss? Do you know how the IRS whistleblower office works?" Miller asked, leaning back. "Specifically Section 7623B of the Internal Revenue Code." Flora shook her head. "I was too busy trying not to get arrested for embezzlement to study the tax code." "Well," Miller began, his tone professional, but his eyes twinkling. "It's a mandatory award program. The law states that if a whistleblower provides specific and credible information that leads to the collection of unpaid taxes, penalties, and interest exceeding $2 million, the whistleblower is entitled to a reward." He tapped the envelope. "Daniel didn't just hide money, Flora. He evaded taxes on a massive scale for a decade. Because of the documents you brought into court, the ledgers, the incorporation papers for Apex Solutions, the U.S. Treasury was able to recover a significant amount of money from the seizure of his offshore accounts." Flora stared at the envelope. The wind howled around the corner of the cottage, but the porch felt suddenly very quiet. "The law stipulates an award of between 15 and 30% of the total amount collected," Miller explained. "Since your information was the primary basis for the seizure, and because you put yourself at significant personal risk to obtain it, the board approved the maximum percentage." "The maximum," Flora whispered. "Open it." Flora reached out. Her fingers brushed the rough paper of the envelope. She tore the red tape and slid out a single pale green check. It was issued by the United States Department of the Treasury. She looked at the name Flora Vance. She looked at the amount. She had to close her eyes and open them again to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. $28,400,000. $28,400,000. "This is..." Flora's voice failed her. Tears pricked her eyes, not of sadness, but of overwhelming shock. "This is too much. I didn't do it for the money, Miller. I did it because he was going to destroy me. I did it to survive. And that is exactly why you deserve it," Miller said softly. "Daniel Sterling spent 7 years stealing your life, your confidence, and your time. He treated you like an object. He thought he could buy your silence with an allowance and a threat. This," he pointed to the check, "this is the price of his arrogance. It's clean, it's legal, and it is entirely yours." Flora ran her thumb over the numbers. It wasn't just money. It was security. It was the ability to take care of her parents. It was the capital to start her own design firm if she wanted, or to travel the world, or to simply sit on this porch for the rest of her life and paint the ocean. "What about Chloe?" Flora asked suddenly. "The girl. She cut a deal," Miller said. "She testified about the trips to Milan and the jewelry Daniel bought her with laundered funds. She got probation. She's back in Ohio working at a diner. She's safe, but she's starting over from scratch." "We're all starting over," Flora murmured. Miller stood up. "I have to head back to D.C. The check is valid as of today. I suggest you get a good financial advisor, one who isn't named Arthur Prane." Flora laughed. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh that felt foreign in her chest. "I think I'll handle my own finances from now on." Miller nodded. He turned to walk down the steps but paused at the bottom. "You know Flora," he said, looking back at her. "In 20 years of working white-collar crime, I've seen a lot of spouses get crushed. They panic. They fold. They take the hush money. You're the first one who ever looked at the devil and decided to rob him." "He made a mistake," Flora said, her eyes drifting back to the ocean. "What was that?" "He smirked," Flora said. "He looked at me in that courtroom and he smirked. He thought he had already won. He didn't realize that by putting me in a cage, he was just forcing me to sharpen my claws." Miller smiled, tipped his imaginary hat, and walked back to his car. Flora watched the black Tahoe disappear down the driveway. She was alone again. She picked up the check and tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan. She didn't need to look at it again. She knew it was real. She picked up her tea, now lukewarm, and walked to the railing. Below her, the waves crashed against the jagged rocks, relentless and powerful. She thought of Daniel in his cell. She wondered if he was smirking now. She wondered if he realized that the trophy wife he had discarded had just cashed out his entire legacy. Flora Vance took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. The golden cage was gone. The world was wide open. And for the first time in her life, she was the one holding the keys. And that is how Flora Vance didn't just survive her divorce. She conquered it. Daniel Sterling learned the hard way that you should never underestimate someone just because they are quiet. He thought his money made him a god, but in the end, it was his own greed and arrogance that handed his wife the weapon she needed to destroy him. Flora walked away with her dignity, her freedom, and a fortune that would ensure no one ever controlled her again. It serves as a powerful reminder. Truth is the ultimate leverage, and justice, while sometimes slow, is always worth fighting for. What would you have done in Flora's position? Would you have accepted the $10 million bribe in the hallway to save yourself the stress? Or would you have risked everything to see justice served? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal and sweet revenge, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.